evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to welcome Lord Darroch here this evening. I'll try not to spend too long just introducing him, but of course he does have a fascinating and illustrious career. So 3 decades primarily focused on national security and foreign affairs. Many of those years with European policy, though of course he was also in the White House as the UK government's ambassador to the US during the first Trump presidency. Also, national security advisor, advising on issues like the rise of Al-Qaeda, the conflict in Ukraine, the nuclear threat from Iran, and the collapse of the government authority in Libya at the time. Before that, he served as the UK's permanent representative to the European Union. That was from 2007 to 2011. He served as EU advisor to the Prime Minister and head of the Cabinet Office European Secretariat, which must look very different today, Kim, than it does now. And very interestingly, he started, I think, your civil service career. You were once head of the news department, I think I'm right in saying, for the Foreign Office. So I think you bring a huge amount of experience to bear, and you studied zoology. And I see we have a canine friend in the audience with us tonight. But if we get round to it, perhaps we can ask how zoology helped you understand international politics. But first of all, when we were discussing how to get this talk going, we were saying, well, we can't really discuss it too much in advance because so much is happening, and of course so much has happened this week. We're 1 day away from the negotiating deadline that President Trump gave for reaching a settlement with Putin and Zelensky over the Ukraine conflict. So what's your assessment of how that's likely to go?
Right. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really great to be here. I have to say I am skeptical about even a ceasefire, let alone a peace deal on Ukraine, and here's why. What you've seen from the president, from Donald Trump himself, over the time since he's taken office and since he famously thought on his inauguration round, this would be the easiest of all the conflicts around the world to solve. What you've seen him doing is a tremendous rush to try and get a deal done, and how shall I put this, a tendency to basically assume that Ukraine has to accept whatever Russia wants. And this latest 28-point proposal amounted pretty much to capitulation. And the deadline was a kind of take it or leave it. Either you accept it, Mr. Zelensky, or we will stop all weapon supplies and other support for you. And what's happened since then is, and I think Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who's a much more mainstream Republican than Donald Trump, has played quite a big role in pulling this back, because the classic Republican view is to be very tough on Russia, so it wouldn't have sat easily with him to basically preside over capitulation. And the Europeans, I think, have played a bit of a role here, as they did after the famous bust-up with Zelensky in the Oval Office, in pulling things back into shape. But every concession that the Americans are making to this pressure from Europeans and from Ukraine, every concession they've made that unravels the original 28-point deal will make it harder to get a Russian sign-off on it. And I think there are already signs that the Russians are simply not going to accept whatever now gets presented to them as the proposition. I mean, it would be wonderful if I was wrong. I'd love to be wrong, because it would mean that Russia had accepted much less than it has been demanding. But the fundamental problem here, I think, is that there are 2 problems. One, Putin thinks he is winning. Horrific losses. I mean, something like 1 million plus killed and wounded of Russian soldiers. 500,000 on the Ukrainian side. But they are making ground, not very much, but a little ground every week in Ukraine, and that will tell him that he thinks, they make him think that they're winning. And it's never been just about territory. So the idea that you just say you can have those 4 territories in Donbass and then it's all fine. It's much more important, I think, for Putin. I mean, he wants the territory, he wants Crimea back, but what he really wants is he wants Ukraine to surrender its sovereignty. He wants Ukraine to accept that it can never join NATO, maybe that it can never join the European Union, that the size of its armed forces are going to be heavily constrained, and maybe that Zelensky has to resign. What he wants essentially is a return to the kind of Yanukovych-style government that existed until 2014, I think. So I don't see Europeans accepting that, and I don't see how on earth, after all the blood and treasure, that Zelensky can accept it either. So I just think we're going to go for a place where the Russians had a deal with the Americans that they thought maybe the Americans could sell, and it's not being sold, it's being pulled back towards Ukraine, and I think it means Putin will just say no.
Well, perhaps we can come back in a minute to President Trump's relationship with Zelensky, but if you were Steve Witkoff, imagining that for the moment, how would you be advising Donald Trump?
Yeah. I think the first thing I'd say to Steve Witkoff is, Steve, I know what it's like to have stuff leaked. I've been there. For those of you who've seen that his leaked phone call with Yuri Ushakov, Putin's advisor, funny thing is when I read that, I used to go and see, when I was national secretary, I used to go and see Ushakov, and he would come across to London to see me. And I mean, he's absolutely classic Russian sort of diplomat stroke hard man, and absolutely inflexible. But there is a sort of human being and a sense of humor behind there somewhere. And he's been with Putin for more than a decade now, so he must have some great survivability instincts. But look, what I would say to Witkoff is going backwards and forwards between Russia and Ukraine, accepting everything the Russians say, and then coming back to the Ukrainians and they say, no, we can't accept that. Accepting that. You've got to try and put some pressure on Russia to accept them things they don't want to accept. And to get there, you have to be prepared to put much more pressure on Russia than they have so far, though we're now in a tougher sanctions regime than ever before. But you need to really, really put the screws on them. And you have to remember that for the Russians, maybe the clock is ticking, because there are lots of analysts out there who think that the Russian economy can't sustain this war effort beyond about another 12 months. And so maybe the pressures will build on Putin over the next 12 months. And maybe, however, I'm afraid it means a lot more bloodshed meanwhile, but maybe we're going to be better placed to get Russia to make some proper concessions in about 8, 9, 10 months' time, if the Russian economy is in as bad a shape as it is, as some predict. The other thing about, if those of you who've read the transcript published on Bloomberg of this Witkoff-Ushakov conversation, and it reads absolutely true. I can almost see my old counterpart, Yuri Ushakov, saying this stuff. It looks as if Witkoff is actually advising Ushakov on how Putin should handle Trump, which is kind of extraordinary. Like, the way you can get this guy, my president, my boss, to agree is you've got to flatter him. Who would have thought that would be the answer with Donald Trump? I mean, where does that come from? But for the negotiator to be so open in saying the most important thing you do is you've got to have, first of all, a paragraph on how great he is. Just tell him for the first few minutes how great he is, and then we might get into some serious business. That's extraordinary. I'd be a bit embarrassed if that happened.
Thankfully, you're not in Steve Witkoff's position, but you mentioned the showdown, in a way, with President Zelensky. Times have moved on, and the relationship is better. But for all of us, watching the news, that is forever going to be a news clip that just gets played again and again and again. What's your view of why that happened in that way? I know there's been a lot written about it, but I think, you know, for those of us who are not as closely involved in how these occasions take place, it just seemed so extraordinary at the time. And I know you have some thoughts about why it happened like that.
Well, if you can bear with me for a little bit, I think there are three reasons why that happened. Number one, you have to remember that Donald Trump is a reality TV star. And his show, The Apprentice, the American version of The Apprentice, which came before our version, I mean, he did that for 10 years, and it was a huge rating success, sometimes the top-rated show in America. And reality TV is ingrained into him. He absolutely understands it. And what he's done with the Oval Office is he's turned it into a reality TV studio. And every day there is a show for his base, for his supporters. And sometimes it is the British Prime Minister comes in and hands over an envelope, and ooh, surprise, surprise, it's an invitation for a state visit. Isn't that nice? Apparently the story on that was the Prime Minister tried to hand it over in their private meeting beforehand, and Trump said, no, 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 give it to me on TV. So this is the way he thinks.
You could teach Keir Starmer a thing or two.
Well, maybe, although you need a certain personality to sort of get that across, I think. But anyway, we'll see. And then, I mean, by the way, it's not just the Zelensky, the Ramaphosa meeting. If you don't realize this is a TV studio, it was set up there to have that film of supposedly white South African farmers being oppressed and this kind of thing. So these things are pre-cooked, and I think the set two with Zelensky was pre-cooked with J.D. Vance, you know, setting it up and then Trump coming in. So that's the first thing. This is a daily show for his supporters. And remember, 60% of Republicans don't think America should be giving any military or other aid to Ukraine. So he's signaling to them, you know, I get what you're saying. Second thing is there is a bit of a grudge against Ukraine because he doesn't think Ukraine helped him when they were fighting the campaign against Biden in 2019-2020, and they thought that the golden bullet was Hunter Biden's laptop and his rather dodgy or his rather strange commercial dealings with this rather dodgy Ukrainian company. And they asked the Ukrainians to help them uncover all the dirt, and they'd refused. So there's a grudge there as well. But the most important thing for Trump about Russia is, and I get this from one of his close advisors. I didn't just invent this, I promise you. But I was having breakfast with him, and he said to me, this is why, you know, Trump wants this relationship, this deal with Putin. His argument is Russia has 45% of the world's nuclear weapons, which is quite significant. It has the biggest natural gas reserves in the world. It's the third biggest oil supplier, and most important, has something like 10% of the world's rare earth reserves, but only produces less than 1% of the rare earths you find in commercial circulation. Why? Because it is hopeless at doing the processing, the extraction, the processing. And Trump thinks there is a huge deal which is very economically beneficial for the US, which covers trade and which covers energy, which most of all has American companies doing the extraction and processing of these rare earths. And that is his big objective for the relationship with Russia and him and Putin. And what does he find? He finds that Ukraine is somehow wrapped around the axle of this particular vehicle, and he can't move it anywhere. And so he wants Ukraine solved as quickly as possible. He has no great sympathy for it as a country. He thinks it's terribly corrupt, and corruption is a big problem there. So he just wants that problem sorted as quickly as possible. And that's why there's such a rush, why these deadlines get set and then mysteriously disappear, as the latest one has.
But it does seem that although the deadlines, as you say, appear and disappear, that it doesn't seem to, in the eyes of many of the American public, it doesn't seem to touch him. I know his popularity has gone down, but there are large sections of America which feels that President Trump and the Republicans are actually serving the country very well. And you know, you mentioned that he was a reality TV show. He has his own social media channel, Truth Social, and his own kind of idea about how truth should be portrayed.
Yeah, I mean, on your first point, Kathy, yes, he is still popular, but he ought to be worried at the moment because the official figures are delayed because of the government shutdown, but inflation is unquestionably going up, and people's grocery bills are rising. And there was a poll a few days ago which said that 76% of the American people now think the economy is going in the wrong direction. So whatever happens on Ukraine, whatever his triumph on Gaza, any of this stuff, if the economy is going badly, it's going to hurt him. So he will be worried about that. But on social media, look, this guy is a genius on social media. And I remember in the first term, because I was there from beginning of 2016, when the campaign was running, and he basically was at war with the mainstream media every day of that campaign. And they were disdainful of him. They thought he wasn't fit to be president. They pursued him. They tried to uncover stories about his own finances or about why is he so admiring of Putin, all this sort of stuff. And he went over their heads in those days using, remember Twitter? Remember tweets, He did that brilliantly. And he communicated with his base direct like that in the mainstream media to a man and woman who were against him, except maybe the Wall Street Journal, and he won. So he's carried on with that. He's fallen out with, or was banned from Twitter, of course, but he's now back on with Elon Musk. But in the meanwhile, he's invented Truth Social. That makes him a bit of money. And I still think that he is the politician on the planet who is best of all, at communicating with his base using social media. He's a genius at it. But the other thing about Donald Trump is, I don't think he's ever believed that his job is to rule for, quote, all Americans. I mean, all presidents come into their inauguration speech and say, I want to rule for all of you. I know some of you voted against me, but I'm there for all of you. Trump thinks he was elected to disrupt and to shake things up, and that his job is to roll over the opposition, not to somehow make compromises to accommodate them. So again, social media is a way in which he communicates with his base, but you won't see anything in there ever that's intended to appeal to people who are not necessarily his biggest fans.
Interesting. I mean, I think it's fair to say that European governments and politicians have struggled to catch up with some of the techniques and ways of thinking of the Trump government, and have succeeded or not to various degrees. You had a bit of a ringside seat with watching Angela Merkel react to Trump, and also with Theresa May, and now you've observed from the distance how Keir Starmer is doing. What's your assessment of how different European leaders, with their own hinterland of rising populism, for instance, are dealing with America at the moment?
Yeah. Can I tell you a couple of stories for this answer? First of all, Theresa May.
I hope you do, because I've got it written here. If you don't tell
me, I have
to tell you.
First of all, Theresa May, we got her into the White House a week after inauguration. She was the first foreign visitor to go and see Donald Trump. And all of the diplomatic corps, they were all besieging the British embassy, saying, please give us a readout afterwards, we don't know what this guy's like. And Trump comes to the front door and meets her, which Obama never used to do. He would meet you in the Oval Office. And he takes her off to a room, an adjoining room to the Oval Office, for a little bilateral, just the two of them, with one official each, and I was the one official. And they start chatting, and then he says to her, Prime Minister, I know you're about to start negotiating the post-Brexit deal, because it was about 6 months after the Brexit vote. And he said, can I give you some advice? And she said, well, of course, Mr. President, you're a famous deal maker. Tell me what I should do. And he said, the very first thing you should do is you've got to sue the European Union. And she said, looking genuinely nonplussed, not surprisingly, she said, well, what do I sue them for? Because it's us leaving the European Union. They want to sue us, but they've not done anything wrong. And he looked as if to say, didn't you get it? He said, it doesn't matter, just find anything, just dream something up. The point is to sue them, and then they'll think, well, this is a bit crazy, this is a really unpredictable negotiator, maybe I'd better be careful how I handle this, maybe give them a few more concessions. Well, she ignored the advice, of course, but For years afterwards, he would say, if Theresa had only taken my advice on how to handle negotiations, she'd done so much better in her deal.
Yes.
And by the way, I checked on his own litigation record. In the previous 4 decades, he had been involved in 3,500 court cases, some as plaintiff, some as litigant. So, he understands courts. He's sort of virtually lived in it. Angela Merkel, very quick story. She goes in for her first meeting about a month after Theresa May, and the story comes out straight afterwards that Donald Trump has handed her an envelope to start the meeting. And he said, "Here you are, Madam Chancellor, I'd like you to read this." And she opens the envelope, and it's a kind of handwritten invoice in there, and it says literally, "You, Germany, owe America $400 billion for all the defense we've paid for over the last 4 decades." And he looked, what do I do with this? And he said, this tells you how much we've spent defending you over the last 4 decades, and you should, first of all, you've got to do more of the defense yourself, and second, you have to, you should think about ways in which you can recompense us for this, because you also have a huge trade surplus with us. And what can I say? Merkel and Trump never really hit it off. So you move fast forward to Keir Starmer. Look, no one would have picked him as a great Trump whisperer. You can't really see the sort of personalities meshing. He's done extraordinarily well. He really has. He did some smart things like phoning Trump after the assassination attempts and commiserating with him, asking how his family were and this kind of thing. He went, which in strict protocol he shouldn't have done, to see Trump before the election on Trump's home ground in Trump Tower in Manhattan. And he didn't see Kamala Harris on that trip, and there was an excuse that she wasn't in Washington. May have been true, may have not been true, but strictly speaking, you shouldn't see just one of the candidates and not the other. And Trump may have also thought that was a mark in his favor. And then he seems to have handled his first meeting quite well with him. So, surprise, surprise, because they can't be talking about Arsenal Football Club, so what are they talking about? Because I know how Trump is in these meetings. He likes lots of banter going forwards. He tells jokes, he tells anecdotes, he changes the subject. I can't quite see Keir Starmer sort of managing that, but he's obviously done it. That said, every day that passes, and for the next three and a bit years, there is a risk, because Trump can decide on a new tariff or change his mind or take offense to something very, just overnight, in a moment, and things can get upset. Final very point, everyone pretty much has learnt from the first term that if you disagree with this man, do it privately, don't do it publicly, don't start swapping accusations and insults, and lay on the flattery. So you had a NATO summit, which is normally an event to talk about substance. NATO summit, that was a couple of months ago, was literally just to flatter Donald Trump. I mean, everyone gathered, everyone who spoke just said what a great job he had done in rejuvenating NATO, and thank you very much, Mr. President. And so everyone is doing it. The only people not doing it, really, are the Chinese. And the great Mark Carney of Canada.
Yes, well, there have been some ups and downs on that front. So, if you are a politician in Europe and you're looking at the rise of populism here, and seeing how things are playing out in the United States, is it, as the title of our talk suggests, a case of just trying to find your way through chaos, or are there some lessons, some kind of pointers on the way that can help politicians and civil servants dealing with the kind of roles that you've had over the years to manage that and to find some way through?
The lessons from my experience over the first term were, I think, are being learnt generally around Europe anyway, which is, as I said, don't take public issue with you. If you can avoid it, if you have differences, try and talk about them privately. Never let up on the flattery. and just watch.
Tell my husband that he has to take it. I think he might be here tonight, so just in
And
case
just
he's
watch
listening.
every day what is in the wind, because the thing about Donald Trump also is that he doesn't conceal things in the way that most politicians do. Whatever's in his head, he tends to say to the press. So stuff that he's about to do or might do, he's often going to preview it and tell the media that something's going to happen. So if you watch it really, really closely, then you can sometimes see what's coming. One tiny example of this, if you read his inauguration speech this time round, he said in it, it's one sentence in it, that he was going to designate the Latin American drug barons as terrorist organizations. Now that's code for saying that under their interpretation of international law, not one that we agree with, they can launch attacks directly on these drug barons, on their vessels, on their landing strips, on their compounds, on whatever. And lo and behold, something like 21 vessels to date, supposedly taking drugs from Latin America into the southern states of America, have been literally vaporized somewhere in the Caribbean. And the Gerald Ford, which is the biggest aircraft carrier in the American fleet, is sitting just off Venezuela, with the American press predicting that airstrikes on land targets in Venezuela are likely. So it was all there, sort of 6 months ago, 8 months ago in his inauguration speech. So follow that and try and understand what it means. There will be times that you have to say, we really strongly disagree with this, but do it in private, but then you can talk sometimes quite directly to him about it. And if it's done in a polite way, he can have a conversation like that. I've heard phone calls where some quite tough stuff is being discussed. But the other thing is watch very closely how the American economy is doing, because if his base is really struggling because of inflation, because of the impact of tariffs, he's not a man who second-guesses himself a lot, but he is a man who will change direction instantly if he thinks that it's harming him. So if you see inflation rising and his opinion poll ratings dropping, because he watches opinion polls every day, then look for a U-turn coming.
Interesting. You spent many years as a national security advisor and no doubt watch carefully and think carefully about how the world is thinking about future conflicts. How do you assess the way the UK government and governments in Europe, particularly those within NATO, have responded to some of Trump's challenges? And as a former national security advisor, would you consider that we are spending enough on defence?
On the second question, absolutely not. And I mean, I slightly wish that the target set by NATO had been a bit more realistic, because I think getting to 3.5% within 10 years, 2035, I just don't think many people will be able to do that. Many countries will do that, and then there will be a big row over why we have fallen short again. So I would have gone for, say, 3% and really made something more realistic. But we've been lunching for free at the American defense table for decades, and it had to end. And it's been coming for a long time. Successive American presidents have asked Europe to spend more on defense, just not quite with the brutality that Donald Trump has employed, and not by suggesting that American commitment to NATO depends on us doing that. And now that's happened, so that is right. But in terms of the national security challenges, look, I think, and I don't think this gets much written, I think Europe has done quite well in dragging the Americans and the president away from proposals on ending the Ukraine war that amount to capitulation. And let's hope that continues with this latest round of talks. And I think that they've handled him well in terms of trying to get him more supportive of NATO in response to, this great victory tour summit. And they're doing about as well as they can. but all of the work they're doing at the moment on a potential European contribution on the ground in Ukraine, though I'm not sure it'll ever happen, but that's also quite good stuff stepping up to the plate. But you can't get away from the fact that no one in Europe is growing their economies very much. Everyone's short of money, so there's a lack of credibility of all these commitments. And Europe looks like it's really struggling, certainly compared with Russia, with America and China. And there's war on European soil, and we're sort of relying on a very unpredictable American president to solve it for us, rather than doing very much ourselves. So it's not great, but it's not nothing either.
Well, we won't discuss the UK budget in detail because we'll allow you a bit of a
I'm
break
ready
from
yet,
that.
actually.
Though, of course,
Tax cuts for everyone? Maybe not.
no, well, we're all very, in Oxford, watching to see how the budget policy will play out. Let's have a little look at the role of an ambassador. We don't have a permanent UK ambassador to the United States at the moment, following Peter Mandelson. So I think you described Peter Mandelson as shrewd. You were a diplomat, of course. And there is talk about the kind of person who Keir Starmer might bring in, somebody who's not necessarily a career civil servant. How do you see that?
First of all, Washington has become a bit of a shooting gallery in recent years, but it's not unique to have a politician there. If you go back through history, politicians have been in that job quite often, and there is some advantage to having someone in Washington who knows the Prime Minister well enough. You can pick up the phone to him, and we'll get through to him. So it's not crazy to have politicians there. I think what's happening on the replacement, obviously the government is in no hurry to do it, and there's a very good chargé there called James Rossiter, who's, I hear, doing a great job. But there is a Foreign Office list of candidates being put across to number 10, and there are one or two really outstanding people on it. But number 10 are clearly looking at other options as well. I don't know if they're looking at any politicians for it. Maybe they've been burnt once and don't want to go around there. They are certainly looking at the business community. And one of the names, I don't know if this is true, but one of the names that's out there according to the media is a man called Varun Chandra, who was head of CEO of Hacklet, which is a kind of consultancy up in Mayfair, but has been the business advisor in number 10 since Keir Starmer took office, and played a big part in the relatively successful trade negotiations that we did. And I know Varun, and he's very good. It's a question of whether the government wants someone who's a foreign policy expert who can talk into the late hours with people in the State Department about Gaza and Ukraine and relations with China, or whether you want someone who is basically focused on the business relationship and the trade relationship. And that's something for Keir Starmer to decide. But if it ends up as being Varun, he's a friend of mine and he'd be very good. If it's one of the top Foreign Office candidates, they'll be good too. That's a very bland answer, I'm afraid, but
it is. It's very diplomatic answer.
Sorry.
It is a very curious job, the job of an ambassador, sort of part event organizer, part confidant, part negotiator. What was it like?
Well, ambassadors, three things. First of all, there's the representational stuff. You're just basically a figure that turns up at lots of things when all the ambassadors, or maybe just the British ambassadors, invited, and you're just there to represent the UK.
I hear you ran excellent parties.
Yeah, I mean, that's the next part, which is about finding out what is going on and reporting back to London that this is about to happen, or this has happened, or this is important, or you can ignore this. And for that, you need to be either out on the Washington social network every night, and most nights would be sort of 3 events, or you need to be hosting, or you're doing both. But basically, Washington you're basically out, not just during the week, you're out every night of the week for months and months and months. So, you know, if you like a drink, it's great. But it's tough, and you're seldom home before about midnight. So, you know, it's there's that side to it. Then there is representing, there is reporting, and then there is influencing. And you would be either in the White House, which I would be in every week, not necessarily seeing the president, but you go into the White House every week to see the staff there, or in the State Department, or sometimes in the Pentagon, or sometimes in the Finance Department, or sometimes in Congress. We go to Congress every week, and you're there to try and project British interests, to make the case for things happening in the way that we want them to happen, for reaching certain objectives that suit us. And that's how it works. I can tell you a story about what being an ambassador is like, if you like, in Washington. Okay. One of the things we did in Washington as a gift, in a way, to the population of Washington, the city, was we had an open day at the residence every year. And everyone who wanted to from Washington could come, and there was a long, long queue at the gate. We opened at about 9 o'clock and did it till 5 o'clock. And there was a route around the embassy compound, and there are the beautiful gardens in Washington, that all these guests would go around. And so we got about 20,000 most of these. If the weather was good, you get between 15 and 20,000 pitching up, long, long queues. And because it was such a big event, we'd get British companies, Rolls-Royce, Aston Martin, Jaguar, Bentley, to set up stands around the route. So as you were walking through the gardens, you'd suddenly come across, you know, a convertible Aston Martin or a Bentley or something, and the idea was that you would at least think, oh, that's a wonderful car. But I mean, actually, they would sell some cars to people who went, oh, I'll have one of those. It's like that in America. Anyway, I like cars too. So I was sitting in the convertible Aston Martin, the hood was down, just admiring it and thinking,
Terrible life.
It is a terrible life. Well, I was thinking, what kind of deal might they offer me? Like, would they give me 1% of its retail price? But I was sitting there, and I noticed this young American guy sort of standing about the distance Nick is from me now, looking at me very closely. And as I got out of the car, he came towards me, and he said, could I have a selfie? And I said, well, yes, of course. And so I stood next to him, and he held his phone out, and then he said, by the way, he said, I love your show. And I said, paused and wondered, should I ask? And I said, okay, what show is that then? And he said, well, Top Gear, of course. You're Jeremy Clarkson, aren't you? So again, I said, actually, I'm not Jeremy Clarkson, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. And he looked very disappointed. I said, but, I am the British ambassador to the United States. Would you like a selfie still? And he said, no. He said, no, I'm not bothered.
Oh, wow.
So there you have where an ambassador stands, you know, the social structures of Washington, which is way behind a TV star.
Well, indeed. But you are now taking up a new role. You have a new role as incoming chair of the Orwell Foundation, which awards the Orwell Prizes for journalism and political writing and youth prizes, and exists to uphold what it describes as Orwell's values of integrity, fidelity to truth, and decency. So, what would George Orwell say about all of this?
We actually had, you haven't said, Kathy, very modestly, you were a trustee of the
I was,
foundation
okay, I was a trustee.
And we have two luminaries sitting in the front row
We do.
over there. But I think George Orwell would be both horrified and fascinated by what's going on in the world at the moment. And I don't think he'd be gratified is the wrong word, but he would notice how some of the things that are happening at the moment were kind of previewed or predicted in some of his great works. And to just give you some examples, you'll all have read 1984, You all know about the Ministry of Truth, which was actually about propaganda and revision of history and about controlling the narrative, and which created misinformation and falsified facts. I just tell you that in this president's first term, the Washington Post ran a daily tally of how many inaccuracies and untruths had been uttered by the president. And over 4 years, the total was 35,751, which is roughly 20 a day or so. And add to that, it's almost exactly a mirror image of what Paul was saying. One of his advisors, who we knew very well and who was great fun at a party, Kellyanne Conway, famously said, when challenged on something on a TV interview that had been going on, and she was denying it, and the interviewer said, "These are the facts. Come on, these are the facts. You can't argue this." She said, "We have alternative facts." That's so Orwellian. So there's all of that going on. You also have, when you think about Orwell describing, how you falsify, you revise the historical records, you spread all this misinformation, all the rest of it. The high priest of the Make America Great Again sort of campaign, the man who was Trump's campaign advisor in his first term, had lasted in the White House for about 8 months until he appeared on the front page of Time magazine, big picture of him looking wise and serious, under the headline, "The Great Manipulator." And then the story inside was full of how Steve Bannon was actually the brains in the Trump administration, so he got fired 2 days later. Anyway, Steve Bannon talks about flooding the zone with, let's call it sewage, but it's a 4-letter word, also beginning with S, that he used. Don't use that here at Oxford. But anyway, that is what's going on. If you want to, tell you another example of this. I went to the presidential debates between Clinton and Trump. And the first one, Trump uttered lots of statistics and facts and things that weren't facts at all. So CNN sponsored the second one, and they said, "We're going to have a team of fact checkers who will report to the audience of millions live if either candidate says anything that is inaccurate or false. It'll come on the ticker tape on the bottom of the screen." So we were actually in the room, but someone else was telling me, he was watching it on the TV, and there were 2 or 3 of these fact checks. This is false, this is an exaggeration, the real figures are this. And then the whole thing stopped after 5 minutes. Why? Because the fact checkers couldn't remotely keep up with the volume of untruths that were coming out. Every sentence was wrong to some way or other, and so they just gave up. And so it never happened, and that strikes me as pretty Orwellian as well. So there's that going on. And then if you looked at Animal Farms, which is about how power corrupts, I read a piece the other day which asserted, it was a very responsible publication, Forbes magazine or something like that, so they haven't made it up, that the Trump family has doubled its wealth in the 10 months of the Trump second presidency. They've gone up from about 2 billion to about 5 billion in terms of wealth. And you wonder where that is all coming from. And then, very last thing about modern life. This is not really about the American president, but Big Brother. Again, back to 1984. Well, I don't know how many of you have Alexa in your house, but we certainly do. It listens to us all the time. It's mysterious how adverts suddenly keep appearing when you talk about buying something. Your iPhone is listening to you. And then, most sinister of all, Vanessa and I were walking our dogs yesterday, and we walk past this house, and one of the dogs sort of escapes and goes onto their drive. And I won't give you explicit details, but there was something to clear up afterwards. So Vanessa goes onto the drive with a bag to clear it up, and a voice comes from nowhere saying, "You are now being filmed." Because there was one of these Ring sort of machines on the front door which was filming outwards for security reasons. I noticed her on there being a very good citizen, but announced, "You're being filmed." We are the most, in that sense, there are more cameras surveying us as a population, I think, than any other country on earth. So there's quite a lot of Orwell that's coming true.
There is indeed. Well, I think that's a good moment. I'm just looking at the cameras in the background. I think that's a good moment to open it up for some questions. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Please do keep your questions as concise as you can so that as many of you as possible can have a chance to talk with Kim. Who would like to go first? I think our host, Charles, the head of the Martin School, should have the chance to go first. And then we're going to go over there, and then we're going to go over there. Yeah.
Thank you. That was fascinating. How do you think Trump is going to cope with increasingly becoming a lame duck towards the end of his term, especially if the midterms go badly?
Yeah, I think he's going to cope very, very badly with it. And I think one of the reasons he keeps talking about, well, maybe I'll run for a third term, maybe some work can be done, is because he wants himself to be the story until the final day of his administration. I may not manage the final day, but if the rumors are circulating, there may be a way of running for a third term, then he will keep that. He will keep them going. He will just say enough without saying it's definitely going to happen. I don't think it will happen, but enough to keep it going. And then he will want to be seen as the man who chooses which of the Republican candidates is going to win, and then make sure they actually win the general election as well as the nomination. And I think it's likely to be between Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance. Vance's advantage is that he will have Silicon Valley money behind him. Peter Thiel, who was his mentor, and a number of others. He's very close to Elon Musk, and people tell me Elon Musk is quite rich, so there's a lot of money there, and that's obviously a big advantage. His disadvantage is he's not really a politician with any track record at all. He only served as senator in Ohio for a few months before he got picked up for the vice presidency. Marco Rubio, by contrast, has been a senator, quite a successful senator in Florida for a long time. So it's not a shoe-in for Vance, even if Vance has a lot of money behind him. But the other thing to say is don't rule out the Democrats, because the story of American politics for the last few decades has been the voters vote in one party or the other, they get buyer's remorse very quickly, and then they vote in the other party. So it has swung between Democrat and Republican a lot in recent years. And the Democrats will have, I think they will have a good candidate. It won't be the old generation. It won't be crazy Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or those people. It's a younger generation coming through. And given that it'll be a new figure on the Republican side as well, I think it'll be quite an open contest.
Interesting. We did have someone in the middle around there.
So jumping around the world a bit, you've talked about one superpower. How should we be engaging with China?
This is going to be a very diplomat's answer, I'm afraid, which is when you're sitting there in the Foreign Office, you have ministers for either party who will at times want to be very tough on China over one of the many things the Chinese can be accused of doing wrong. They have trade barriers, mostly non-tariff barriers in China. They do steal intellectual property. There are questions about the human rights record, justifiably. They haven't really fulfilled the Hong Kong agreement with us, and they bully their neighbours and particularly are threatening Taiwan. All of the stuff you want to be tough on. The problem on the other side is that China gets 7% of our exports, and for some companies, the obvious one being Jaguar Land Rover, it's massively important. So as a diplomat, when ministers say, what are we going to do, because Chinese have just done this, we need to be tough on them, you say, well, you can do this, this, and this, but remember, Minister, that the Chinese almost certainly will retaliate, and there are tens of thousands of jobs in this country that depend on trade with China. This sounds terribly craven, but it's a reality, and you just have to, ministers have at least to be aware of the potential economic consequences of things that you can do against a country like China. When I was first National Security Advisor, for 18 months after I started, it happened before I started, but the Chinese basically stopped all senior political contact with us, with cabinet ministers or prime ministers, because the then Prime Minister David Cameron had dropped in on a meeting between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Dalai Lama in St. Paul's, literally just dropped in. Turned out this was largely down to the Foreign Office thinking that the Chinese were very upset, and the Dalai Lama went through the front door of number 10, that famous photograph. But if the Prime Minister just drops in on him on a meeting in St. Paul's, that'll be fine. Well, it wasn't, as it turned out. So there's always that risk of retaliation. So any government or any political picture is going to want to have it the best of both ways. They want the freedom to be able to say publicly what China is doing towards Taiwan or towards its neighbors or towards some of its population or on Hong Kong is unacceptable, and we're going to speak toughly to them about this while not disturbing an extremely important trade relationship. And that just needs you walking a tightrope the whole time. But it's the only way to do it, I would say, because I just don't think we're strong enough economically to be able to say we don't care about the Chinese market. If you think that's a problem for us, it's much, much bigger for some European countries. Germany, which is not a five times bigger economy than us, does 5 times as much trade with China as we do. So all the Europeans will be in this place. If the Americans come to us in future and say, can you impose trade sanctions on China or some other measure because of the way the Chinese are behaving on some issue or other, you'll find the Europeans will be very reluctant. It's just reality.
I think we also had a question on this side. I'm terribly sorry. I think it was the gentleman down there and then near the front. Yeah.
Thank you. My background is in psychological medicine, and it seemed to me from the very first Trump administration that we were dealing with not only a man with a deeply malevolent personality, but also showing the signs and symptoms of cognitive confusion and decline. That seems to be even more manifest now. And I just wonder whether our administration and other administrations, when dealing with Trump, actually take this into account. People often talk about him being a great leader. You've mentioned him being a genius. I see a very mentally disturbed and chaotic and cognitively impaired man.
I think
interesting. Sorry,
at this point we have to be aware that, you know, the BBC is already in trouble with the President of the United States. So I'll just draw your attention to that, Kim.
Yes. Yes.
That's it. That's the answer.
When I talked about it, I did say it's in a box called social media, and I do think that Trump has used social media in a way that no other politician on the planet has as successfully as. And you know, maybe genius is slightly uncomfortable in that context, but it is extraordinary what he did with social media to basically climb over a mountain of hostile mainstream media and still win an election. Look, on his physical health, I have to say to you that in his first term, I mean, obviously I'm not an expert on cognitive decline, but I did see him in action quite a lot. First term, his energy was absolutely unearthly. He was doing 5 speeches a day in the final weeks of the campaign. Hillary Clinton was doing about 2 a week. It was just extraordinary, his, the energy that he brought to his campaign, and it made a difference, I think. I do think that Trump in his second term is physically, he moves more slowly and more gingerly. He's got a stoop now he didn't have before, and he's definitely showing his age more, but then he's 8 years older than when I saw him in action in 2016, 9 years older. And he's approaching 80, so he's what he is. By the way, if you want to read a fascinating book on the history of the last election, read a book called Original Sin, written by a friend of mine, Jake Tapper, who's a prominent American journalist, about the evidence that has now emerged about the physical and cognitive decline of Joe Biden in the last 2 years of his presidency. And Joe Biden should never, ever have run. And if you'd had a younger, from the start, a proper primary process, and a younger, more dynamic candidate who probably wouldn't have been Kamala Harris, you might have had a different result. On Trump, look, I talk to people who are in meetings with him, and they don't tell me what you've suggested. physically, as I say, I think you can see that he's definitely showing that he's 8 years older than he was last time round. He's always said stuff that is unexpected. He saw the new Japanese Prime Minister recently, and they were talking in front of the cameras, and she said to him, Takeichi, her name is, Sanae Takeichi, and she said to him, Mr. President, the Japanese government is going to nominate you for a Nobel Peace Prize. And he apparently said to her, you know, you have a very strong handshake, which was something of a non sequitur, although she may well have a very strong handshake. So, there's always these sort of disconnects when he's saying stuff, but I think it's just sort of Donald Trump in a way rather than anything more than that. So, I mean, you're an expert on this, and I'm not, but I haven't heard. I mean, he occasionally gets names muddled up when he's doing speeches and gets that, but then so do I. So, you know, it happens.
I know we do have an audience online watching us this evening, so I think we should, in fairness, take one of those questions, Chris.
Yes, thank you. Question from a member of our online audience. How can the United Nations get involved in the relations between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, the United Nations, and I wish it were otherwise, because for most of my 40-odd years in the Foreign Office, it was one of the first things you turned to when there was a crisis. Can we get a UN Security Council resolution? What should the UN be doing? And it's never been more marginalised than it is at the moment. And it's not just down to America not paying much attention to the United Nations. Russia and China block almost everything in the Security Council. And so everything that we try to get the Security Council to do, just gets blocked straight away. So the Security Council has not passed a meaningful, important resolution, it feels to me, for years. And so I don't think there's any way of getting them involved between America and China or America and Russia, honestly. I think they're just on the margins until you find leaders in US and China and Russia that are more interested in using it. I mean, the whole of the post-World War II rules-based international order is kind of on life support at the moment, because international law isn't much respected. International institutions, not just the UN, but also the World Trade Organization, are marginalized. And at the moment, we're in a kind of power-based international order, a sort of might is right international order, where you see it playing out in real time. I mean, the last two big meetings that Trump's been involved in have been with Putin in Alaska and with President Xi in Busan in South Korea. And where's the UN? It's not there. Where is Europe in all of this? Because Europe is still the world's biggest single market and a very rich part of the world, but kind of ineffective in terms of international diplomacy at the moment.
Chris, do you want to go for one more from online, or shall we go live? Okay. Now, it might have to be whoever puts their hand up most quickly, because there's so many. I think we have a question here, and then...
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Just to ask you about, if I might, the circumstances of your return to Britain, because the media portrayal of that, and it may be entirely wrong, perhaps you can correct it, was that to a certain extent you were caught in the middle between two strong and less trustworthy figures, between Trump and Johnson, and that perhaps you were thrown under the bus, that in other circumstances you might have been able to stay in Washington and it would have been desirable for you to do so.
Honestly, I thought within 24 hours of my reporting, which actually was 2.5 years old when it leaked, I thought I'd have to resign, because it became clear to me from a few sort of private contacts that the White House wouldn't let me through their door. And you can't do that job unless you go into the White House once a week. So I'd concluded within 24 hours I would have to resign. And then it was just a question of clearing it through London. And I decided to resign before Boris Johnson failed to say that he would keep me on, although his opponent at the time, Jeremy Hunt, said I would keep on. So but Jeremy wasn't going to win that election. So, you know, I wasn't really bothered about what Johnson said. And I always expected Trump to respond in that way. I mean, there was a previous incident a couple of years, a couple of decades before that, where something the previous ambassador had written about Obama had leaked, and it wasn't entirely positive about Obama. And the Obama team didn't say anything. And he stayed on and finished his term. But I knew it wouldn't be like that. So, to be honest, I mean, it was 6 months from the end of my term, my career anyway. So, you know, you think, well, if it happened sort of 10 years previously, it would have been quite a blow, but 6 months off, you know.
Enough material to get you going for writing the book. That's the main
I wrote
thing.
the book, which is still available on Amazon, by the way.
Sorry.
And I have basically made a career about talking about Donald Trump. So,
But there seems to be plenty of subject matter. A few more, I think we have time for a few more questions. Jean. And then I'll go over there.
As you may have noticed, the BBC has been decapitated. So
Yeah.
leaving aside all of the internal boring stuff about why that's happened, what advice would you give to the chairman and some incoming director general about how to deal with the threat of a Trump libel case against one of our major institutions? I cannot think of another institution that's been attacked. Leaving aside the fact that the case has no legs, what would you advise them to do practically?
Okay. I would say three things, Jim. Number one, obviously, splicing together those two bits should never have happened. Everyone knows that. It should never have happened, and it's extraordinarily unprofessional, and someone should have spotted it, though no one spotted it for years, exactly. But anyway, it was wrong, and although it was done by an independent company, there were some BBC people seconded to it. They should have spotted it. Second, absolutely, I mean, I would say what they've done is the right line. You shouldn't be offering, they've made a formal apology, it's quite an abject apology, and they had to do it, and they should have done it much quicker. But I wouldn't be engaging on damages or anything like that, because you have to demonstrate harm. And it's quite hard to demonstrate harm if the program has never been shown in America, isn't it? I would have thought. So I think you have a very strong legal case. I think Trump, because it's in his nature, was always going to say, I'm going to do it, whatever. I mean, 3,500 cases in his, that's what he does. But you shouldn't be intimidated by that, and you should just say, we apologize, we don't think there's any harm, but we're not paying damages. And the last thing I would say is this. I mean, I did 40-odd years in the Foreign Service, and I travelled really quite a lot there. And I just worry about the way that the BBC is assaulted and the way it is in this country. It makes mistakes. Maybe it's a bit too big and a bit too bloated, and it's not got the structures right to avoid these mistakes. But I can tell you it's the most respected news organisation on the planet. And if you watch American TV, there is nothing on it like the BBC in terms of the authority and accuracy and dedication with which it covers current affairs. It's a huge part of our soft power as a country, and in no way, if the French had the BBC, they would be pouring money into it, and there'd be none of this criticism of it. Of course it should be criticised if it gets things wrong. Of course it should improve its process and all the rest of it. But it's a huge national asset, and I just worry that sometimes you get a sense that it's going to be diminished somehow.
I'm going to go to the gentleman at the front, who, for those who are watching online, has a rather quiet and delightful dog on his lap.
Yeah.
Dog's not going to ask the question.
My canine companion has asked me to ask you what zoology taught you about diplomacy.
Do you know, first of all, I'm an accidental diplomat, because when I left, I was at Durham University, and when I left, I had no idea at all what I wanted to do with my life. Still don't really, but my then girlfriend said, sitting over there, said, why don't you try and join the Foreign Office? And I thought it an improbable mission, but to my surprise, it succeeded. And it's a really nice thing about the Foreign Office, because you talk to most of your counterparts from other foreign ministries, and they all studied modern languages, or they studied international relations, or something like that, or they studied law. Foreign Office, there weren't any other zoologists. I think I may be the only one still. But there were other scientists. And one of my best friends, who I'm still in touch with, was an astrophysicist, actually at Cambridge, I think. He joined the Foreign Office. And there were other people with a wide range of degrees. They weren't all classicists. And I think it's a real strength of the Foreign Office that they can do it. They have their own entry system, their own exams and whatever, so that it doesn't matter what degree you did. Now, was it an advantage? I will avoid the obvious answers and say yes, an advantage, but the reason you might guess, which is when you do sciences, I mean, I can't speak for how it is if you're writing about history or whatever, but you have to think very logically through a problem and then try and lay out how you get through it to your solution. I was a soft scientist. Zoology, you write stuff, you don't do equations or whatever. But you think your way through it, and it's a very logic-driven process. And then you have to present it in a way that is accessible. And honestly, that's a really good model for writing political or policy submissions to ministers. It really is. I found myself a bit ahead of some of my contemporaries. People said, well, it's because you write a bit better than them. It's all the training from writing about scientific subjects and trying to explain complicated things in sort of simple language, straightforward language. So that was the biggest thing. Plus, of course, if you're into zoology, you tend to like going off to sort of interesting places where you may be a little bit away from classic civilization. And I used to go, when I was in National Security Advisor, to war zones down to the Helmand Valley in Afghanistan, off into the jungle in Thailand with the Foreign Secretary to talk to Burmese, Myanmar refugees, all sorts of really exotic places that were, you should enjoy that very much, and maybe that is part of why you went into science in the first place.
Interesting. Chris, are you telling me there's another question online?
If we could go to an online question.
And we have a couple more minutes afterwards for some questions from, perhaps one from my side.
What are your thoughts on the possibility of a Trump-style type of politics in the UK? Do you think that this is the antithesis of the UK's traditional values, or do you think it's how politics is going to play out now?
Look, I don't think Trump would have worked his way up through a political party, got into Parliament as a backbench MP, served his time on the backbenches, and then ended up as Prime Minister. He just wouldn't have ever done that. And I mean, some would say it's a strength of the American system that a businessman who never served a day in public office can get to be president. But I think I prefer our system. And I think there are lots and lots of checks and balances in our system that you don't have in the American one. I think that Prime Minister's questions, although people say it's all very ritual and very choreographed and everyone's trying to get sound bites on, but I can tell you every Prime Minister I worked for found it really, really testing to be challenged for 30 minutes once a week in a house of people, many of whom would like to see you fired or lose your job. So I think British politics is quite rigorous. I don't think you can get away with, Boris Johnson, we all know, eventually got booted out by a Standards Committee. Is that what it was, the Standards Committee? Liaison Committee, that's right. Because he hadn't really told the truth to the dispatch box quite often. So that will bring you down in British politics. So I don't think a Trump-style presidency is going to work here, which is not to say that populism isn't alive and well and thriving across Europe, but it's kind of different from what Trump is doing.
I'm going to take one question on this side and one question on that side, and then, Chris, you'll tell me if we've run out of time. So I think this
You have to take him.
gentleman in the front.
I should realise he's a former colleague.
Nice to see you again, Kim. You're very pessimistic about the prospect of a peace in Ukraine, Russia, at least in the short term, and I think you're almost certainly right. are you equally pessimistic about the prospect of a real solution beyond the ceasefire in Gaza?
Yeah, I thought someone would ask me, and thanks for asking me, Ivor. Look, first of all, I have to say this. I mean, whatever you think about Donald Trump, he was the man who delivered the ceasefire in Gaza because he was prepared to put pressure on Netanyahu in a way that Joe Biden didn't seem prepared to. And so he deserves some credit for that. And stopped the fighting and has given us the possibility to talk about what might come next. The trouble is that the ceasefire is kind of, although it took a long, long time to do and Biden couldn't do it, it's the easiest bit of this because you now have to, number one, you have to find some sort of Palestinian leadership for Gaza that excludes Hamas, that is basically technocratic, and that the international community and the Israelis are prepared to work with. Secondly, some sort of international body overseeing it. Looks like if it exists, if it is created, Tony Blair will be on it. But what their responsibilities are and what their authority is, and whether the American president can overrule this body at some point or other, if he disagrees with what it's recommending, there are big questions there. Then you have to have security guaranteed in Gaza, and it seems to be the idea is an Arab force drawn from Arab countries. But I can tell you Arab countries will not send their soldiers or their policemen to Gaza unless the rules under which they're operating are absolutely clear, unless they're not standing effectively as a barrier between the Israeli Defense Force and what is left of Hamas inside Gaza. So negotiating that is extraordinarily difficult. And then fourth, you have to get reconstruction started in Gaza. And people think that the rich Arab countries will pay for it, which they might, but I promise you they will not pay for it unless they think there is a route to a durable solution to Gaza and the Palestinian issue, and that the only one that works, I promise you, is a two-state solution, which most people think is dead or on life support or whatever, but actually is the only solution that can possibly work there. And getting through those 4 steps to a point where we actually have some kind of process going is going to be extraordinarily difficult, and it's not a job for leaders, it's a job for experienced negotiators who know the area and know all the problems to get there. And I'm not sure it's, I wouldn't want to bet my house on it happening. The other thing I would say is, if those people living in tents in Gaza are still in tents in 3 years' time, they will be extraordinarily angry, and they will blame the international community for not delivering on the promises they think they've been made now. So there's a kind of clock ticking on all of this, and if we don't get some delivery over the next 2 or 3 years, then I think there's going to be another explosion there.
We only have a minute or 2 left. I'd like to take a question from this young man here.
Do you think there's a chance for war between NATO and Russia?
I think that Putin, if he wins in Ukraine, if the West lose interest or we can't supply enough weaponry for the Israelis to resist the Russian army, I think Putin will look for other opportunities. I think there's other opportunities. It could be Moldova, where there is already. With Transnistria, a breakaway republic, it could be somewhere in the Balkans, or it could be the Baltic states, all of which, but especially Latvia, have significant Russian minority populations. But if he does something overt against a NATO country, Baltic states, some of the Balkan states, then you are in Article 5 territory. So I think he'll do what he's sort of doing already, or maybe testing out doing that, which is kind of hybrid warfare, which is stuff that you can't be sure that the Russians are doing, or maybe you can be sure you can't prove it, and which doesn't necessarily cross the threshold for Article 5. And I think some of the stuff you're seeing now with drones some drones went a long, long way over Polish territory. There's stuff going on over Danish airports, over Baltic state airports, this kind of stuff. I think this is sort of testing us. They're skirting our territorial waters in the UK, and they're apparently pointing lasers at our pilots' eyes and that kind of stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on that suggests the Russians are trying to intimidate us and trying to test us. And we just need to be up to that sort of challenge and able to show that we are serious and capable of resisting it. But I'm just not sure that that means we're going to NATO, Russia, World War III. I think it means we just have to up our game, to spend a lot more on defence, and we have to show that deterrence works.
Thank you. It's always, particularly at these occasions, really hard to give everybody a chance to ask a question. It's been a great evening, Kim. Thank you so much for joining us. I think a combination of wit and wisdom, and a career that has spanned so many different international issues. And I think I'd like to finish on a sort of hopeful note and say that you've obviously had in your career so many difficult moments, but also I'm sure many moments where you have felt that you've been the luckiest man ever to have met such interesting people. And I just wonder if you can finish by giving us a very, very brief just vignette of something, a memory that sticks in your mind that you felt really made you pleased you had the career you did.
A good moment, you mean?
Yes, please. I mean, we've had chaos, we've got, navigating the chaos war. Let's have a bit of,
Yeah. Right, now I hadn't sort of thought about this in advance, so now I'm thinking rather randomly of what it might be. And the thing I think this is such nostalgia because we've left now, but when I was ambassador to the European Union, we had a number of really critical negotiations, one about the budget, which maybe sounds a bit technical, was a big thing at the time. And then we had the negotiation that was about the Lisbon Treaty, which had been the Constitutional Treaty and then became the Lisbon Treaty. And remember, negotiations kicked off because they weren't going to abandon all the work from the Constitutional Treaty. Kicked off. And I had to put a note to the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and say, well, these are the things the other Europeans are all looking for, and some of them will be very difficult for us, and some of them will be easy. So I came back and said, well what do you think will be easy and what will be difficult? And I sent him a note saying, my view, these are the things people will press for in terms of changes to the European treaties. I think these 5 or 6 we could accept, and you can live with, you could defend that in the House of Commons, and these we couldn't. And I think you can win on these, and this one may be quite difficult, but the others, I think you can win on if you really sort of negotiate hard and know all your facts and stuff. And this chunted on in the way these European negotiations did for months and months and months. It came to a European Council, and this was the real European Council where the thing was going to be settled. And Blair, and it went on for about three days or so, 3 or 4 days. But as the ambassador, I was one of the only official allowed into the room, so he kept going in, and the Prime Minister was, sometimes they were in formal session, he's sitting there and you can go up and whisper to him and tell you what's going on. Sometimes they'd broken up into little groups where they were basically arguing with each other and stuff. I remember going in, and the last problem was something that the Belgian Prime Minister in particular objected to, and I went in and talked to the Prime Minister and said, well, why not try this and this? And he tried it, and that was the thing that got, from our point of view, the deal over the line. Didn't mean to be finished because there were other arguments going on elsewhere in the room, but it was a tweak that I had suggested and that Blair had tried on it, and it actually delivered this last thing for us. I remember about 3 a.m. in the morning, the deal eventually got done. I'm just more tired than anything like that. But I went back to my original submission from months and months before. The things I think you can get, the things that I think you can successfully knock back won't go. And I've been, dare I say it, 100% right. Stuff that I thought we could. Now, Eurosceptics would say, you're just giving everything away. But we weren't, I promise you. We were maintaining our extraordinary special deal in Europe, outside Schengen, outside the euro, all these other things, that special deals we negotiated, and that had all been embodied in this new treaty. And it was just, I felt proud about it because I had successfully predicted how 26 other countries would negotiate and what they would in the end accept. And I mean, Blair is quite nice about me and about one or two other of us in his book on this, but it felt like that's 40 years worth of
You nailed it.
practice and training and understanding how multilateral negotiations work, and then you nail it.
Job well done. Thank you.